Welcome back, AP. All right, so we're now getting into our count it third unit that is going to be actually being in our tested curriculum for AP European history, right? And we're now moving into this very, very massive, very all-important unit, and it's one of my favorites to teach because I get to talk about all these funky characters, Louis XV, I am the state, like all this other stuff, right? And we're moving into a unit that is all about absolutism and constitutionalism, right? And we talked loosely about this today in class, and y'all are making this beautiful project that I can't wait to see, and I'm not even going to I don't even think I'm going to be able to mentally handle it. Like, I really don't. I'm so excited. I've got other teachers that are coming up to me being like, I want to see this thing. I want to see this thing when it's done, right? I think that they're going to be coming in doing like a social media post about it as well. So I'm so impressed. You guys are making waves, all right? But what we're getting into now is we're talking about a unit about absolutism and constitutionalism, right? We're talking about the crest and peak of religious violence that occurs in Europe coming up in about 2 seconds. And then we're also going to talk about, kind of for 2 seconds, we're going to talk about like the lives of regular Europeans during all this time period, right? So really quick though, just so you know, before you move forward, before you can talk about absolutism and constitutionalism, which are the forms of governments that are ruling over these European individuals, you got to talk about the people that they're ruling over, right? So during this time period, you've got 4 social classes, right? Or 4 given, classes, right? You've got the ruling class, which is your monarchs, right? Your royal families, your Stuarts, your Tudors, your Rurkids, your Romanovs, your Bourbons, your Valois, your Habsburgs, right? You've got all those people. I bet you are. The Hohenzollerns, right? Like all those important figures, right? You got these famous ruling families. That's your ruling class, right? Then you have your nobility class, right? Your nobles, which happen to be like other families that could be vying for like power or like growth of ideas and things like that, right? Very, very important noble families. And then you've got your third class, which is the world's tiniest middle class, right? Like just right middle class, very small. All right, so like very, very tiny, and it's made up mostly of guild workers, right? Like mostly of merchant guild workers and craft guild workers that are making some money off that commercial revolution, which I know, Marie Rolla, you asked, do I need to know it for the last test? No, but do you need to know it for this exam? Yes. All right, so, and by the way, remember, I'm sending out the DBQ, the gradable DBQs, and all your other stuff tonight when I get home, okay? But you then have your fourth class, your biggest class, your most populated class, your overwhelmingly large class of Europe. That's your peasantry, right? And the rest of Europe is becoming much more aware that they exist, right? So, because during the Middle Ages, no one really thought about the peasantry whatsoever, right? But now we're starting to understand them a little bit, right? And we're starting to understand that most citizens, right, of Europe, especially of Western Europe, lived in the countryside, right? Far away from the cities. Most of them lived in farming communities. Most of them still functioned as serfs because feudalism is still a thing. And also, if you lived in a city, you were typically extremely wealthy or you were typically very poor, right? There was no really big middle ground. If you were a part of that small middle class, maybe you probably worked around the outside of the city, but you very rarely lived within its walls, right? Now, most poor people and peasantry lived on the edge of subsistence. And what I mean by that is they are farming enough to keep their families alive, and whatever, if they live on their own land, which is very surprising and almost never happened, they would sell whatever they had extra to try and make as much money as they could, or that extra food would go to the noble who would then sell those wares off and then make money off of it himself, right? And also, industrial output during this time period is next to nothing, all right? So you've got most of your goods now coming in from North and South America that are going to be all these new products that no one's ever seen, right? You've got gold and silver coming in mass, right? And the output of your industry is strikingly low, right? So basically, your peasantry of Europe is a very rough life, right? It's a very, very intense time during this moment moving into absolutism, right? And the big thing about it is that's mostly in Western Europe, right? Now, what about in Eastern Europe, right? Because here's the thing. Most of Europe is going to see a departure from serfdom, right? Because in Western Europe, the Black Death, economic revitalization, the commercial revolution, things like that are going to lead to a decline in serfdom. So you're going to see less and less serfs that are still bound to working certain land areas by contract. You're still going to see a huge number of peasants who farm and farm as much as they can to provide for themselves and for a family if they can support them. And you're also going to see people entering into guilds. But in Western Europe, you are seeing a decline in the use of serfdom and the use of feudalism. But is that going to occur in Eastern Europe? No, because Eastern Europe is like technologically and economically about 100 years behind Western Europe, right? I would jot that down if I were you. Because in the 1500s, Eastern Europe is going to see a return to and a strengthening of feudalism, right? Prussia is going to even enact, like this is an example, so you're going to see feudalism and feudal laws come back in full force when it comes to being a peasant in Europe, especially in Eastern Europe. If you lived in Polish Lithuania, Prussia, Russia, the Moldovan region, any area basically to the east of the Holy Roman Empire, you were seeing serfdom getting stronger. You were seeing serfs becoming more of a thing. You were seeing feudalism becoming much more ingrained in their economy. Let's think about for 2 seconds why that is, right? And if we're looking back here at this map that sits behind me, right, basically looking over there, it's because when you're talking about France, Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, England, they all now had economies that were based in that commercial revolution, sending those ships out to the North American and South American colonies, bringing goods back and making money off of it that way. So they didn't have as much of a need for serfdom anymore. Whereas Prussia, the edges of the Holy Roman Empire, and then also like Austria, and then also Polish, Lithuania, and Russia, they're going to see a need for serfdom because they're realizing that they have no chance to compete in that trade market yet, right? So you're seeing a bigger return to it. It, in fact, apparently at one point got so bad in Prussia that lords were allowed to hunt serfs down like slaves. If a serf tried to run away, Prussian lords and princes were within their rights to hunt them down and drag them back to these feudal territories, right? Local lords would serve as judge, prosecutor, jailer, and basically peasant life, if you were living in Eastern Europe, was really, really struggling, right? Now, the thing about it, though, is off the backs of this suffering and off the backs of this, like, hunting down a serf like they're a slave, this is actually, ironically enough, going to aid in the economic growth of the Eastern countries, right? Prussia is going to make more money this way, right? Because they're not going to be able to have nobles who are making more wealth, and they can tax those nobles, right? Same thing in Russia with the boyars. And actually, we're going to get into that, too. We're going to have a lot of names for some nobles popping up, right? Nobles is what you call a noble in, in England, and then you're going to have sword and robe nobles, then you're going to have junkers and boyars and all these other people, right? But because the commercial revolution had taken such strong hold in Western Europe, the growth of feudalism actually had a positive economic effect in Eastern Europe, right? Now, moving forward, though, okay, something crazy happens, right? Speaking of the peasant classes, speaking of all of these people, it is important that you understand that we're now moving away from that, right? So we talked about peasant life. We talked about how peasant life is really rough. They're living on the edge of subsistence. They're trying to farm as best they can. You're seeing a less amount of serfdom in Western Europe, a return to serfdom in Eastern Europe, having different economic effects, right? But now we're moving into a very pivotal moment in European history. We are moving to the apex, the crest, if you will, of religious violence that occurs, right? And that happens under the 30 Years' War. And I know right now, Belanger and Kimberly are both like, but the 80 Years' War was longer. You are right, but it's not as violent as the 30 Years' War, right? The 30 Years' War is going to be the last huge religious conflict, right? And it is a very important event when you're discussing the growth of power in Europe, right? Because, let's back it up, right? Back up, Terry, put it in reverse, all right? So the last we heard of religious violence was the Schmalkaldic Wars, right, under Charles V. We talked about some violence broke out in Switzerland, ended up leading to Zwingli's death, right? Zwingli. We talked about Calvinists being persecuted in the French Wars of Religion, right? We talked about Henry is going to convert to Catholicism. We are going to review this stuff a little bit at the beginning of class on, when do I have y'all again? Thursday. All right, so like now, But that's all going to be kind of neutralized with this thing known as the Peace of Augsburg, right? So the Peace of Augsburg under Charles V is going to be a document signed, I believe, in 1555 that is going to allow the Lutherans to write the Confession of Augsburg outlining their faith, and then it makes the Holy Roman Empire basically a multi-religious state, right? And the way they accomplish this is because the Holy Roman Empire is a loose confederation with an appointed emperor, right, as we know, right? Now, ever since Charles V, the emperor was no longer appointed as often. It usually just meant the Habsburgs were going to bribe their way into ruling it every single time, right? So basically it turned into a de facto Habsburg monarchy as well, right? So Gia and Belanger right now are probably like, oh, wait, that's probably going to be important. And some of our research assistants right now are probably like, oh, wait, when we were talking about Austria and the Habsburgs, we should probably also talk about how the Austrians didn't only just rule the Austria-Habsburg, but they also ended up ruling over the Holy Roman Empire, right? The Austrians were super powerful, like crazy, crazy powerful. And they kind of ruled over the HRE like it was a puppet state, right? Now, the problem, though, is once Charles V signs the Peace of Augsburg, inside of that document brought in a concept called cuius regio eius religio, right? And what that means is the religion of the leader is the religion of the land, right? So, like, basically, since it's a loose confederation of states, if you had a German prince who was a Protestant, the people now were supposed to be Protestant. If you had a German leader that was Catholic, his people are supposed to remain Catholic. And early on, this was a great solution, right? Very good solution, super solid early on. Notice I say early on, right? Because following the Schmalkaldic Wars, where do you think these princes are getting these armies to fight wars? It's not like Heinrich is going out to fight by himself. He has loyal people that live within his kingdom that are also the same religion that he is, right? So chances are, once the Peace of Augsburg was signed, whatever faith you believed in was also the faith of your prince. But it's only temporary, because the issue is that now we're also seeing the rise of Calvinism, which is not included in the Peace of Augsburg because it didn't really exist yet, because this was signed in 1555, and I believe that Calvin doesn't even write the Institutes of Christian Religion until 1565, the Institutes of Christian Religion, which was written in... Crap! It's published in 1536. Man, I'm way off. All right, so... definitive editions appearing in 1559. Eat it. All right, so, anyway, so his ideas didn't even begin to expand until after the Peace of Augsburg was written, right? So Calvinism's not included in it. And then also what's occurring is, yes, you're saying whatever you are is what you are, but these German princes are going to reorganize again. And the Schmalkaldic princes aren't going to call themselves that anymore. They're then going to begin to refer to themselves as the Protestant Union, right? And then the German princes inside the HRE are going to call themselves the Catholic League, much like the Catholic League that popped up in France, right? A coalition of Catholic princes and a coalition of Protestant princes, right? And things are getting very tense, right? Now, war doesn't erupt just yet. War finally erupts, though, in the 30 Years' War in the Bohemian Phase. Some of you are like, oh my God, that's so much to write. Yeah, it's a lot. I apologize. Now, the big thing about it is, though, is that you got to understand that there are 4 phases to the 30 Years' War, right? Phase 1 is the Bohemian Phase, when the Protestants and Catholics finally start fighting one another again, right? It's very short, and it only lasted for 2 years, right? And it was localized, too, right? So in the Bohemian Phase, just so you know who the Bohemians are, right? Let's go ahead and jump back to our thing real quick. Wait, what do I do? Wait, no, I don't want to go up there and draw it. So, here's what we do. Map of Europe, 1700. All right, so... Yard. All right, anyway, now, here we go. So when I'm saying Bohemia, you got to know where Bohemia is, right? So Bohemia is actually located in the modern-day area of the Czech Republic. So you're talking about this area right here, right? Czech Republic / Czechoslovakia area, okay? Or not Czechoslovakia. That hasn't been a thing since the 90s. So, like, Czech Republic / Slovakia, right? And what ends up occurring there is a Catholic prince is now going to be appointed to be the prince over a Protestant populace, right? So when the Bohemian prince died, a prince then replaced him from a different family, and the problem was he was Catholic, and the people that ruled over him he was Catholic, and the people that were under him were Protestant, right? And so what ends up breaking out is there ends up becoming some violent, some violent outlashing that occurs during that phase, right? And during that phase, you're going to see Protestant peasants pop up and demand that they are allowed to worship in their own way, and they're getting very aggressive, and violence breaks out following a very, very important event called the Second Defenestration of Prague. And the Second Defenestration of Prague literally starts this 30 Years' War, right? And what a defenestration is? A defenestration is a fancy word for this: throwing someone out a window. All right, so like two people, as you can see, the prince himself and his Catholic advisor were hucked out of a window in Prague, right? These Protestant leaders showed up and they were like, we refuse to listen to any of your Catholic garbage, and they hucked him out a window, right? So, and the funniest thing about it is that this is the second defenestration of Prague, which means it's happened once before, right? So anyway, very, very funny thing is the height of which they fell. This is the building, and that is the window right there that they were actually thrown out of, and they fell over 70 feet to the ground below. And the two guys that actually ended up like getting hucked out the window, they didn't die. They only broke their legs and a couple of their arms, right? So, not a couple as in both, but like they each broke an arm, right? So, they ended up dying, or not dying, they ended up living and not dying from this fall. And some of you are like, how the heck do you fall that far and not die? Well, Catholics claimed that angels swooped down from above because their religion is right and saved them. Whereas the Protestants were like, we didn't look below the window and there was a giant pile of horse manure down there, so a giant pile of poop saved them, not angels, right? And so I love that story. I think it's hilarious. But anyway, that starts the Bohemian Phase. So it's a lot of local violence, right? You're going to see some small-based local violence where basically what ends up occurring is Protestant princes and Catholic princes within the HRE go to war with each other, and it really just kind of ends up settling out being kind of a draw, right? So then you've got the Danish Phase, right? Now the Danish Phase is started when a Danish king of Denmark, who's not even important enough to talk about, the king of Denmark shows up as a Protestant, right? And he backs all of the Protestant princes within the Protestant Union, and he tries to help them take over Catholic lands. What he doesn't realize, though, is he gets there and he's like, I'm here to help you guys because you said you needed it. And then the Protestant Union princes didn't even show up. And so it's just the Danish king by himself fighting the Catholic League alone, right? And he actually didn't receive the support that he needed. The Danish king ends up losing. And then the Edict of Restitution, the Catholics end up getting a buttload of land back from the Protestant Union princes. So that one is going to be like come to a small conclusion, right? But the two big ones are very important.
Please be seated and quiet for lunchtime prayer and announcement.
Announcements, hold on. Sorry about that. Had to wait for announcements to wrap up, right? But it was a perfect little stop time, right? Because now we're seeing something weird happen in the 30 Years' War, right? We talked about the Bohemian Phase, right? Oh, Second Defenestration. And so, like, throw them out a window, right? Just like from the window to the ground, right? Throw them out of there, right? So, like, that's going to be a big moment, right? Because the Protestant Union, like, princes are going to fight against the Catholic ones. And then you're going to see the Danish Phase, right? Danish king shows up. I'm here to help. Bap, bap, bap. Like Catholic Union League or Catholic League, like, smacks him down. Then you're going to see the craziest thing happen. Then a Swedish king enters. Mr. Terry, I thought you said we didn't need to worry about Scandinavia. Well, right now you do. All right, so, like, the Scandinavian king himself and Protestant Gustavus Adolphus II, I believe, is going to be the Swedish king who rises up during this time period and demands to support support the Protestant Union, right? And this guy, the all-around BA that he is called the father of modern military, right? He shows up with a force like none other, right? He has literally legions of men carrying spears called pikemen. He has men carrying guns for the very first time, and he also has mobile artillery units or movable cannons, right? He literally separates them into separate divisions, and he becomes literally the father of modern military structure, right? Absolutely ridiculous. We'll end up talking about him a little bit more in depth in class, but Gustavus Adolphus arrives, and he's the Swedish king, and he's a Protestant, and then he is there and allies with Cardinal Richelieu? What? A French Catholic? Wait a second. This makes no sense. I thought the 30 Years' War was Protestant v. Catholic. So you got to understand, the motivations switch, right? So in the Bohemian and the Danish phase, it was all about religion, right? It was all about Protestant versus Catholic. That is how this is. Bang, 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 right? So whereas in the Danish phase, not the Danish phase, in the Swedish phase, it switched to being about politics, right? It switched to being political because remember, how do the French feel about the Habsburgs? They hate them, right? So they can't stand the Habsburgs. So they decide to support Gustavus Adolphus in his journey into the Holy Roman Empire to destroy as many of the Habsburg leaders and their princes as possible. So ironically enough, you had French Catholics fighting other Habsburg Catholics during the 30 Years' War because the motivations have now changed, right? So, and Gustavus Adolphus leads a very successful invasion of the Holy Roman Empire, weakening it from the inside out, right? Then what unfortunately happens, though, is following some very famous battles, like the Battle of Bright Bar and several other ones, Gustavus Adolphus does die in battle, right? Then it moves into the French phase, right? And in the French phase, you see Cardinal Richelieu versus the Habsburgs fall out, right? He goes against the Habsburgs in Spain, he goes against the Habsburgs in the Holy Roman Empire, and he creates a very, very well-financed and a very well-functioning army with the Protestant Union leaders at his back, right? And so it turns into Catholic France versus Habsburgs. So we saw a massive political shift right there. And we will talk about Cardinal Richelieu much more in depth and how he's a villain in the in the Three Musketeers movie. But we're now also going to talk about briefly just kind of what the 30 Years' War looked like, right? So when you're looking at the 30 Years' War, you got to understand that it just looked like no other war anyone had seen before. When I said Gustavus Adolphus showed up and he reorganized the military, I can't underestimate that or understate that enough, right? This is how the 30 Years' War was fought, okay? Protestant Union soldiers and Protestant soldiers were typically poorer than Catholic forces, right? Catholic forces were usually very, very wealthy, and they would charge at Protestant Union forces all the time using the most well-funded piece of their military, which was their cavalry, right? And so with that, you're going to see a very, very important, come on, I had a really good picture. Man, I'm going to have to look it up again. Protestant troops, 30 Years' War. And so what would occur all the time is Catholic forces would usually use their cavalry to charge at, Catholic forces would use their cavalry to charge at Protestant ones, right? I can't find that other picture. I have to find it and show it to you in class. But in this sense, what's going to end up, there he is. What's going to end up occurring is Gustavus Adolphus reorganizes his military using cannons and several other factions, and he actually creates a division of pikemen as well. So as the horses are charging at them, the pikemen would lay their pikes down in front of them, the horses would run into them, and they would dethrone these cavalry units, right? And he would then also have divisions of musketmen, right, or musketeers that would actually have the very first use of guns in a war, right? So guns were used for the very first time. Now, these guns were terrible and awful and very inaccurate and garbage, but they still are a very, very big, triumphant, thing that exists, right? You're going to see guns and cannons be used heavily within the 30 Years' War, right? So gunpowder weapons are not going to make their debut. Their debut was in the 100 Years' War, but their efficient usage was in the 30 Years' War, right? Now, granted, they weren't the best. They were fuse-lock muskets, which literally means that you had to keep this thing burning and pour a little bit of black powder right here and go clack, and it goes, and it just sends a bullet out the front of it. And we'll talk about how inaccurate they were and stuff like that in class. But still, you're now using guns to kill people mounted on horseback rather than actually just bows and arrows, right? So with this also, though, Gustavus Adolphus was the very first person to invent volley fire, which actually means showing up and being like, ready, aim, fire, and everybody shoots at once, creating a spray of bullets rather than just individual shots, right? So Gustavus Adolphus organized pikemen, musketeers, mobile artillery cannons, and he is going to change the face of war forever in the 30 Years' War, right? Now, another really sad thing, though, is you're also going to see an extreme amount of peasant death during this war, right? Speaking of the peasants we just talked about, right? So what would happen is you would have these roaming troops of Protestant soldiers or Catholic soldiers wandering into provinces that were hyper-Catholic or hyper-Protestant. And what would occur usually is they would walk into a farm and be like, hey, are you Protestant? And they would be like, yes, we are Protestant. Are you? And they'd be like, yeah, we are too. And you would think that they would support each other. But no, the Protestant forces would be like, good stuff. We're going to take all of your food now. And it would lead to massive amounts of starvation throughout the Holy Roman Empire and also throughout many other regions of Europe, right? So you're leading to peasant starvation due to this, right? Now, let's say hypothetically a Protestant force showed up or a Catholic force showed up and an opposite one, right? Let's say a Catholic force was like, hey, you Catholic? And they'd be like, no, we're Protestant. This would occur, right? Mass executions by other religious forces against peasantry, townspeople, women and children, right? Literally, when you Google the 30 Years' War, this is the first image that comes up when you're talking about the 30 Years' War on Wikipedia, are mass executions of Protestant or Catholic forces against Protestant or Catholic towns, right? So literally, if they arrived, they would mass hang, execute, and then pillage farms and take all of their food, right? So literally, you're also going to see the spread of disease and pestilence, right? So you're talking about a very violent war that led to a lot of peasant death, more so than people that actually died in the war itself. People who died in the military, just to give you a figure, only about 750,000 people died. Only, that's aggressive. About 750,000 people died in the actual military functioning of the 30 Years' War, right? Through all those phases, 750,000. But the war would be brought to a conclusion with this thing called the Treaty of Westphalia, which marks the end of time period 1, right? You guys are literally now already 25% away through the coursework. Blows my mind, right? The Treaty of Westphalia, though, marks the end of the 30 Years' War because it's a series of treaties that concluded the 30 Years' War, and it marks the end of large-scale religious violence. The Peace of Augsburg will be re-ratified, and Calvinism will be made legal, right? And it will actually be made legal within the Holy Roman Empire, and it's going to set the tone for Calvinists to be able to freely function throughout all of Europe, right? Now, does it necessarily mean that Calvinists aren't going to be persecuted in France later on? No, because like oh my God, that's terrible. Louis the 14th ends up literally burning and destroying a lot of Huguenot churches and ends up executing a lot of Huguenots as well. But it's just important to know. But the results of this, the peasant population is going to be decimated. It is predicted that 20% of peasants died during this war, right? 4 to 6 million. As many people died in the Holocaust as they did in the 30 Years' War, right? Or excuse me, in the Jew. And that's actually a very reasonable guess because this is a conservative one. We think it's 3 million on the low end, 12 million on the high end because we have no idea because records weren't accurately kept, right? Disease and pestilence is going to spread during this, leading to more death as well. Extreme famine, almost 10% of these deaths were caused by starvation, and the European power is going to shift dramatically. And you're going to see the Holy Roman Empire begin to just cripple, shrivel, and die. This is the death bell. This is the death rattle of the Holy Roman Empire, and it just kind of limps along for over 100 more years, but it is never the power that it once was following the 30 Years' War, right? Because it has been decimated by the 30 Years' War. Their peasant population is now almost wiped out, and then also you're seeing people like France grow in power. And this led to absolutism being a massive growth because of the power vacuum left following the 30 Years' War. So I know that one was long, it was very intense, and there were moments where I seemed confused. It's mainly because I hate this president, I gotta fix it, all right? But it's okay in the long run. We talked about people getting thrown out a window and falling into giant piles of poop, all right? So we'll talk about that stuff later on, even more so. I'll see you guys later. Y'all have a good one.